Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Get CME for this episode by clicking on the CME links in the show notes. Today, we welcome Andrew Budson. He's a neurologist, and he's the co-author of the book, Why We Forget and How to Remember Better, The Science Behind Memory. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
So we'll get into your book in a little bit, but first off, just briefly share your story and journey to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I actually started off in high school being interested in trying to understand, how does this lump of gray cells that we have inside our skull, how does that produce things like thinking, memory, thoughts, consciousness, and things like that. And then I actually pursued that in college. I was a double major in chemistry and philosophy, trying to get both sides of the problem. And when I entered medical school, I knew I was either going to do psychiatry, neurology, or neurosurgery. And neurology just seemed to be the best fit, both for the questions I was asking, and also they seemed to be like my people, the people I enjoyed hanging out with. And so after my neurology residency, I did fellowship in cognitive behavioral neurology, and at the same time, did a postdoctoral research fellowship to really try and dive into those questions in a very specific way, doing cognitive neuroscience research, where you're trying to put the cognitive thing, like memory and thinking, into the neurons, like, cells and what activity is actually going on in the brain. And I chose memory to study both as a research and as a clinical topic because it's the most clinically relevant field. So that sort of led me to sort of have a dual career, being, both sort of a memory disorders clinician and also a memory researcher. And that is where I am today.
So in your clinic as a neurologist, in Alzheimer's specific clinics, tell me what's the typical presentation patients would be referred to you for.
Yeah, so either the patient themselves, the family member, or sometimes the clinician, notices that there are some difficulties with memory. So one common and important way that patients get to me is the clinicians like prescribing them an antihypertensive medication, and their medication doesn't seem to be under any better control when they see them back in the clinic. They're raising the dose, they're adding a second agent, and then they realize, oh, the patient is not remembering to take their medication. So then they would refer them to us, and we would be able to, sort out what's going on by doing a comprehensive history of the problems. We do some pencil and paper testing as part of our routine evaluation. We rule out things like thyroid disorders and vitamin deficiencies with blood tests. We get a structural brain imaging study. And usually by the time we have all of those pieces, we're able to offer a diagnosis at that time and begin to talk about treatment.
All right, let's talk about your book that you co-wrote. It is titled Why We Forget and How to Remember Better, The Science Behind Memory. So tell us, how did this book come together?
Well, it really started a couple of years earlier when I wrote my first book for the public, which took on the problem that I had noticed first and foremost in patients who were coming to my clinic. And the problem that I noticed is that most people just don't know what is to be expected as the memory problems that occur with normal aging, and how do those differ from the memory problems that occur with Alzheimer's. So that book was called 7 Steps to Managing Your Aging Memory, what's normal, what's not, and what to do about it. And so that all went very well. And then I went to tackle the second most common problem, which I saw, which is what family members can do to help manage all the problems that come up in the moderate to severe stage of dementia. Because there's so much knowledge that family members and other caregivers need to know to deal with all sorts of different behaviors. And so that we dove into in our book, 6 Steps to Managing Alzheimer's Disease and Dementia, a guide for families. But then what I realized is that there were all these other people out there who would often have neurologic problems, from seizures, from Parkinson's, from multiple sclerosis, from a traumatic brain injury, that would like to better understand, what is the problem with their memories. And I also had the experience of watching my daughter go through high school and college, and realizing that we know a lot about the best way that we can help improve everybody's memory, how to improve people's memory if they had a traumatic brain injury, how to improve memory if they're just a normal high school or college student and they want to be able to study smarter, for their tests and exams and things like that. And so what my co-author and I decided that we would do is we would work on designing and writing a book that would explain, how does memory work? How does it break down in these different types of diseases? And how can you use this knowledge of how memory works to actually improve your memory in day-to-day life, whether you're recovering from an illness, whether you have a chronic illness, or whether you're just a healthy individual.
Yeah. So without getting too much into the book, I would love to hear what are some of your tips in terms of translating how memory works into how we can remember better. What are some of your main ways to do that?
Yeah. So one sort of first principle that is very important and isn't always intuitive is that the more effort that you put into remembering something, the better you will remember it. And the way that this comes into play and why it can be counterintuitive is, let's consider two different common ways of studying. So one is, many people like to highlight and then reread portions of their textbook. And I confess, when I was in medical school, that was like my number one method. I had like 4 different colors of highlighters, and I'd highlight all the different sections and I'd reread them the night before the test. And I know other people, some of my friends, they would sort of take notes from the textbook, make flashcards, and test themselves on it. And it turns out that highlighting and rereading, not only is it not the best way to get it into your memory because it's not active, it actually gives you the illusion that you know it when you really don't know it that well. Because when you reread the same section, it becomes easier and easier to read. And because it's easier to read, it gives you an illusion that it feels like you know it. And it turns out the harder, effortful task of writing things out on note cards and testing yourself is a far better method of studying. But if you ask college students, this study has been done, if you ask college students which of these two methods is better, they're 50-50. So most people don't know that it's actually, when things seem harder, you remember them better. And this gets at this whole concept of learning styles. So we often think like, well, I'm a visual learner, I'm an audio learner. Well, it turns out that if the learning comes more easily to you, it's not going to stick with you as well. And everybody learns best if you learn both audio and visual together. So that's one basic principle. I'd love to tell you one more.
I would love to hear that.
This is an acronym that we have built into the book that covers a lot of different research all combined into one. And the acronym is the word FOR. There's 4 things that students in particular can do to really enhance their memories. You want to focus on the information that you're trying to learn. That's the F. The O is you want to organize it into a way that it makes logical sense. The U is make sure you understand it as deeply and richly as you need to understand it. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to remember it well. And the R is to relate it to something that you already know. So between effort and the 4 principles, this in and of itself can change students, from a C to an A.
How about outside the academic setting, in a real world setting? Let's say someone who's out of school and they just want to, on a day-to-day basis, just maintain their memory and not let that deteriorate. What are some tips you have in that scenario?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we talk about in the book is, to work to understand some of the different components of memory and see if you're having trouble with one of them. So for example, let's say somebody is having a little bit of trouble paying attention, and they might have trouble with paying attention because they have attention deficit disorder, or because they're feeling anxious, or for whatever reason. So we can actually all learn to pay attention better, which is the first principle to remember anything, like people's names that you meet at a cocktail party, or even just remembering the experiences you're having. You have to pay attention. And people can work on learning to pay attention better. And my favorite technique on this is actually practicing mindfulness. When we engage in mindfulness, we're actually working on trying to control our thoughts to pay attention to what we want to pay attention to, whether it's focusing on paying attention to our breath, or the environment, or whatever it is. So that can be a helpful tip. If we're paying attention, but then the problem is that we don't know it 2 or 3 days later, the helpful thing to do is at the end of, say, you're meeting a person at a cocktail party, or at the end of the day, spend a minute and review whatever you have learned or whatever experiences you have had that you would like to remember better. So some people like to write things down in a journal or a diary, and that can be very helpful. Other people just like to review their day before they go to bed. I actually like to do that. I spend a minute, I think about, the different things that happen during the day, and I do work on remembering names. I'm not good at names innately, but I know the tricks. So as long as I apply the tricks, then I can actually remember them better. And by reviewing names before you go to bed, and other things, your daily experiences, that will help bring that into long-term memory.
One of the things that you mentioned in your first book caught my attention, the differences between quote unquote normal forgetting versus more pathological forgetting
Yeah.
that could be a sign of Alzheimer's. So what are some key red flags to look out for there?
Yeah. So in normal aging, there's generally 3 things that individuals have trouble with. And it all has to do with the fact that the sort of frontal lobes don't work quite as well as they used to in normal aging. And because of that, people often need to hear or read the information they're trying to learn more than once. It may take a little bit longer for people to retrieve the information that they're looking for, and they may need a hint or a cue in order to retrieve it. So those are all part of normal aging. But in normal aging, as long as the information got into the memory store, it should be able to be retrieved. Now, in contrast, in Alzheimer's disease, the problem is that even when information is repeated, even if you wait a bit of time or give a hint or a cue, the information is rapidly forgotten. So in that case, people end up, asking the same questions sort of again and again and again, because, they're given the answer multiple times, but they can't hold on to it. The normal person, they're trying to come up with a name, of a restaurant, you give them a hint, they got it. The person with Alzheimer's, you can give them a hint, give them a cue, they have no memory as to, what restaurant it was.
We're talking to Andrew Budson. He's the co-author of the book, Why We Forget and How to Remember Better, The Science Behind Memory. Andrew, tell us some of your take-home messages that you want to leave with the KevinMD audience.
Yeah, well, I'm hopeful that, whether you're listening to this podcast and you have a healthy memory and everything is working fine, but you just like to, make your memory a little better or understand how memory works, or you're a person that's had, one or another disorders that's affecting your brain. I'm hopeful that you'll learn things in this book that will be able to help you remember better.
Andrew, thank you so much for sharing your time and insight. Thanks again for being on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.